name's Ilan Goldstein. I'm one of the directors of Scrum Australia. I'm a local certified Scrum trainer. I'm also the author of Scrum Shortcuts Without Cutting Corners, a book in the Cohn Signature Series. So, awesome to be back here. I see a lot of familiar faces. I see a lot of new friends that we warmly welcome into the ever-growing Scrum community over here. Now, I have to admit that as a conference organizer, you tend to stress, right? You stress pretty hard. And the main thing you stress about is whether people actually bother turning up to your event. Now, in the case of Scrum Australia, sold out a week in advance with a massive waiting list, I think that that stress was a little bit misguided in this case. The thing I'm most stressed about is that people missed out now. Now, the thing is that this ever-growing popularity of Scrum that we're seeing is a trend that I've been witnessing in my travels globally. It's certainly no exception in our own backyard. Harvey touched on this briefly just before. In fact, the rest of the study Harvey was referring to was a study conducted late last year with a sample of over 4,000 organizations globally. 84% of them say that they're doing some form of Agile. Okay? This 84% is primarily driven by this thing, what you're here for, Scrum, with 73% of that overall 84% saying they're doing Scrum or some form of Scrum blend. Now, here's the thing. While I think the recognition is good, I think that's positive. There's a recognition that, hey, we've got to try something a bit different here. I can pretty much assure you that a solid portion, if not the majority, of that 84% are running what I'd call misguided. Misguided, maybe perhaps warped adoptions, okay, paying lip service to the movement. Now, a big reason for this is perhaps an overall lack of quality Agile education out there. And really, without the right education, misconceptions form that are generated by propagated myths. And these myths lead organizations astray towards these misguided, somewhat warped adoptions. As a certified Scrum trainer, I work with hundreds of different groups. And you know, I'm afraid to say when we initially engage, there are a lot of myths out there. So today, what I want to do is share with you some of the more common myths that I encounter, and together we're going to bust them all up. So I want to warm up a bit. I want to warm up with some terminology myths. So why not start right at the top, the name of the whole framework itself, okay? Now, many folk, even so-called qualified Scrum Masters, tend to think that Scrum is an acronym. They spell it in full caps, okay? You may find it interesting if you are sitting in that camp right now to find out that Scrum is in fact not an acronym, although I will give a free copy of Scrum Shortcuts to anyone who comes up with an awesome Scrum acronym, all right? So the first person to come see me after this with an acronym gets a free copy. Anyway, you might be interested to find, if you are in that camp, that Scrum actually relates to the game of rugby Scrum. Now, we live in Australia. When I'm doing this in the States or in Sri Lanka, it's a bit trickier. People don't even know what rugby is, but we know what rugby is, and we know what a Scrum is. For those who might not know what it is, it's a tight pack, a tight group of 100+ kilo rugby players joined together like a jigsaw puzzle, working together as one to drive back their opposition and progress towards their try line, their score zone. And it's this concept of tight, self-organizing teams that gave birth to this original idea. Now, I just want to point another thing out. I've got limited time. I don't want to send this conference behind, so we'll hold wallaby jokes until lunch, okay? Now, this initial comparison between Scrum, the sporting variety, and Scrum, the Agile variety, was first identified, and this comparison made by the so-called godfathers of Scrum, okay? Takeuchi and Nonaka in their 1986 groundbreaking paper in the Harvard Business Review, the new product development game. Now, for those who have witnessed a sporting scrum in action, and most of us probably have, it's very similar in concept to this ancient shield-locking Spartan phalanx. Really impenetrable if discipline is maintained and teammates work as one. So there you go. We've busted the first myth up. Scrum is not an acronym. Please do not spell it in full caps in your tweets. All right, now let's stick with the sporting theme. And let's go a little bit deeper into terminology, because labels can really screw things up a bit. Who can have a guess what the next most heavily abused Scrum term might be? Anyone? Who said it? Sprint? Yeah, sprint. Oh, and why is this a problem? I'll tell you why this is a problem. People see this. They hear this. Because when I say sprint to you, what conjures up into your minds? Fast. Breakneck speed, right? And what generally happens at the end of a sprint? Something like this. You're kind of stuffed, aren't you? You're exhausted. It's unsustainable. How often and how long can you keep that pace going? And I fear that this particular term, innocuous as it may seem, may actually be behind some of these heavy adoption rates that we saw earlier. Why? You tell me one stakeholder who doesn't want their team working faster than their current group of people who seem to be just strolling along right now. A stakeholder hears this and they go, wow, awesome, sprinting instead of just jogging along, crawling along like we are at the moment. So the thing is, we have to understand where this word came from, what the intent is, okay? Now, Scrum totally backs up the 8th principle in the Agile Manifesto that talks about sustainable development practices. And sustainable is not sprinting at breakneck speed the whole time. So what is sprint referring to? Well, I think it's an unfortunate choice of word because it is easily misunderstood. What it's actually referring to is focus and distance rather than speed. We're thinking to ourselves, we are working in short distances. Why is that a good thing? Because it affords us the opportunity and the ability to regularly step back, take a breath, see what's going on, inspect and adapt. That is in contrast to the alternative, which is a never-ending treadmill or a never-ending marathon with no end in sight and perhaps some sort of post-implementation review post-mortem right at the end. That's the idea behind the sprint, so think distance, not speed. Okay, distance, not speed. Now, while a Scrum team may or may not be faster than a so-called traditional team, what they should be faster at doing is delivering the highest value end-to-end features, because we're cutting the lead time and we are baking in testing and quality along the way rather than leaving it as an afterthought at the end of a very long marathon. Okay, so sprints do not equal speed. What do they equal? Distance. Okay, distance. All right, we've warmed up a bit. I want to take things a bit bigger picture now. I want to talk about this next myth. The fact of the matter is a lot of people think that Scrum is an approach only for software development. Now, I won't argue with the fact Scrum was certainly born in the software space. And the reality is, that's where most of the application still is, and that's where most of the stories are coming from. Most of our class attendees are still in this space. However, if you read the Scrum Guide, okay, for those who have read this fundamental rule book, so to speak, of Scrum, you may notice that there is no mention of software, no mention of engineering anywhere within. Now, why is that? The reason is simply that Scrum is purposely abstracted above that level so that it can be applied in a whole host of other contexts. Some of you may have heard that the Saab Gripen fighter plane was built using Scrum. The Wiki Speed car was built using Scrum. We've personally helped organizations use Scrum to build research papers, no line of code in that, marketing campaigns, learning and development materials. Scrum can certainly work outside of that space. Hey, Scrum Shortcuts was built in an incremental and iterative fashion as well. So the thing is, Scrum is not just for software development. Think about it as much bigger picture there. All right, so speaking of books, here's another common issue that I hear out there, common myth. That myth is this one. Scrum is anti-documentation. Documentation is bad. We should never do it. We're agile, and that is why we use this magical user story format. Okay? Why do we use this? Because, hey, it's minimal. We don't need documentation. Now, here's the thing. Here's the thing. This myth, I feel, is really generated from this Agile Manifesto because, hey, doesn't the manifesto say it just there? Working software over comprehensive documentation. Hey, doesn't that mean we don't need to document? Got any Agile cowboys in your organization? Yeah, this is the most common catch cry I hear from them. You're not getting documentation, we are Agile. Agile's not about that. The problem with the cowboys out there who shoot from the hip, a bit untamed, use Agile as an excuse for not doing things correctly, they tend to forget about or they're unaware of a really important footnote to the manifesto. The footnote goes like this. While there is value to the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. Let me paraphrase that. It means we're not getting rid of anything on the right necessarily. Not at all. We need to think about that, though, in a more fit-for-purpose way. Okay? We need to think, what are we trying to achieve here? We need to see the items on the right as a means to an end, not the end itself. For example, if we are a startup, there's 2 or 3 of us in a garage together, do we need to communicate via 200-page spec documents and via email? Probably unnecessary. Probably a lot of overhead that is going to hold us back. However, if we are working in a multinational finance organization, if we have got to stick to various audit standards, whatever they may be, ISO, CMMI, SOX, guess what you are going to need? You are going to need a lot more of everything on the right to support your end game of building a working and relevant product. And that's okay. That is okay, as long as it is supporting that end game of a working and relevant product. The thing is, a product is not just lines of code, and it's not even lines of code with testing thrown in there. Your product may also include documentation. Documentation for audit purposes, for support purposes, for training purposes, for sales and marketing purposes. We may need that as part of the actual product, so we don't shy away from it at all. In fact, we take it just as seriously as anything else that may go into our incremental definition of done. As my mate Martin at the front there likes to say, documentation for collective organizational memory is very different to documentation that we use to generate a perceived idea of control up front. Did I quote you okay? Yeah. You happy with that? All right. Take it. All right. There's a big difference. Documentation is not bad. The thing that Scrum is saying, the message that we want to take from this is this one. We need the right level of documentation and the right level of detail in our documentation at the right time. We don't do away with it. We say to ourselves, what do we need? Is it fit for purpose? Is it supporting what we are trying to actually achieve here? That is the name of the game. Scrum is not anti-documentation. So I spoke about this construct of the user story just before. Okay, so let's actually, I want to head down that path a little bit and talk about a myth related to this user story. Now, Harvey actually touched on this earlier when he was talking about the core of Scrum and the ancillary approaches The thing is, a lot of groups that we initially work with feel that this user story format is mandated, that they must use it, okay? This, as a something user, I want to do something to achieve some benefit, okay? Now, while I personally think it's a good idea, I like this format, I primarily like it because it helps us to get that right level of detail at the right time. It also has a focus on the outcome rather than just on the output. We've got that third clause there, right? Why do we want this? What's the benefit? I like it, but it's not mandatory. And we need to remember that our product backlog can be very cosmopolitan. For example, we may choose to use user stories for every PBI, product backlog item on our product backlog. We may choose to only use it for end user type functionality. And in other words, we'll use a different format for defects, a different format for research requirements, a different format for environmental work. We may not use it at all, and that's okay, that's fine. It is an optional element, okay? So please, we need to differentiate between what is core and what is an approach. An approach that you may or may not use, and you may use the approach, sometimes you may not use it in all cases. Okay, the user story format is not mandatory, although, as I said, I personally think it's a good idea. Now, there are other so-called agile accessories, if you want to look at them like that, that have managed to really tightly couple themselves to Scrum to the extent that people feel that if we are not doing these activities, then we are not doing Scrum properly. Okay, what are some of those? These are the common ones we see. Okay, so planning poker, the sprint task board, the sprint burn down. A lot of people feel if we need to do Scrum, we have to do these. Let's tackle the first one. What's planning poker? So planning poker is, of course, the approach, the technique that we use to implement the idea of relative estimation at our product backlog level. Now, again, I like it. I think it's a good approach. Works for me in most cases, but you don't have to use it. In fact, Scrum says you don't have to estimate anything at all, ever, if you don't want to or need to. Some groups don't need to estimate at all, and that's cool. Some need to estimate at a release, long-term forecasting level, at the product backlog level. They may use relative estimation to do that. Others also like to estimate at a sprint backlog level, okay, using half-day blocks, full-day blocks, hour blocks, whatever you choose. Again, these are all approaches. None of them are mandatory. You don't have to do any estimation if you don't want to. But again, I personally think relative estimation is generally a good idea if it's done properly. Okay, if it's done properly. It's completely optional though. Okay, this thing here, everyone knows what a task board is, highly synonymous, almost that symbol of Scrum. Guess what? The so-called symbol of Scrum is also optional. No one says you have to have a task board. Here's the thing. Whereas relative estimation, I would say most of the groups we work with utilize it or try to utilize it, I'd say all of the groups we work with at least have some kind of visualization to help track their iterations or sprints. I think they're a really good idea, but again, just to reinforce this point, it is an approach, it is not core. This last one for me has got more questionable value, okay? It needs to be used a bit more cautiously. What am I talking about? The sprint burn down. Now, the sprint burn down back in the day, in the earliest Scrum guides, was a core element. These days, it has been deprecated. And why is that? Well, the sprint burn down, which has been used to track on a day-to-day basis the progress of any given sprint, has tended to be used by certain types of stakeholders as an aid to micromanage, okay? This is not what we want. Just to give you an idea, I'll just quickly go through how a traditional sprint burn down would work. You'd have your y-axis, you'd have your x-axis. Y-axis is the aggregate sum of the hours for the tasks that have been allocated to a sprint, if you've been estimating them in hours, of course. And the x-axis is tracking the days of a sprint, so a typical two-week sprint. So what teams would do, they would track they've burned down how many hours for the tasks are remaining each day. And hopefully it burns down. Now, the problem, though, with a sprint burn down is that it doesn't always do that. Now, what a lot of teams would do, they would draw this theoretical line, okay? Who's done one of these before? Yeah? A lot of you, yeah? You draw this theoretical line, and you'd use this as a so-called benchmark to see if you're ahead of schedule, you're behind schedule. Now, what's the problem with this theoretical line? The problem is that, in reality, a lot of sprints actually tend to burn up before they burn down as teams discover more. They are trying to gain some momentum, okay? They look like this. And you know what happens? Then you get some stakeholder who wanders by the team's area, sees a graph that looks like this, and says these sorts of things, okay? You've just started, you're already behind. How crap are you guys? I've unfortunately seen this in action, and it's not cool. And I'll tell you what happens. I'll tell you the byproduct of this kind of mentality. You're going to start seeing these, okay? What's that look like to you? It looks like a perfect, utopic, beautiful looking sprint. What a brilliant team. If I see this, I know something is horribly wrong, right? Not necessarily with the sprint, but with the culture of the team. What this is telling me, a profile that looks like this, the team is either afraid to really speak reality or they've baked so much buffer into these task estimates to render them meaningless. So that's what I've got against the sprint burn down. However, it's not all bad news. I do find that it can be helpful in a couple of cases. Firstly, if our team is tracking behind, perhaps it gives us an early signal to prompt the team to have a chat and say, okay, we are tracking behind. How can we better galvanize? How can we better mobilize so we can swarm more to at least finish as much as possible rather than have everything in progress at the end of the sprint? I like it for that reason. I also like it because it could give us an early prompt that, hey, we're actually tracking ahead of schedule. We found some neat way to do something that we didn't think about. So it's a good guide to prompt perhaps our product owner to ensure that we have got sprint-ready PBIs sitting at the top of the product backlog in case we have to pull something extra in. The message here is that it's not all bad. It can be really useful, but it can also be really dangerous. So please use a sprint burn down if you choose to use it very carefully. And if you find that in the early days there is a culture that doesn't necessarily support this type of approach, get rid of it. It's not core to Scrum. These accessories, think of them as approaches. They are not core, okay? So you don't have to use them. All right, now I want to switch to the beginning, right to the beginning. I want to talk about a term that has become quite popular. It's used a lot. It's this idea of sprint zero. Who's heard of sprint zero before? Okay, I can't blame Scrum for this term, by the way. This term is not a core Scrum term, nor is it a core Scrum activity. What we are referring to here is this inception type work that needs to occur potentially before we kickstart our first, let's call it, delivery sprint. Okay? There are certain activities that we may need to consider. Now, I'm kind of gentle on the sprint zero term in my book, and since it was published, I've really learned to dislike the word. It's the problem with publishing. It's very unagile. You can't just go and update it. What I don't like about it is the myth that it really generates around the fact that Scrum can only be used on small, trivial type projects. Why? Because this term sprint implies that we have to fit in all of these activities within a 2-week period. Okay? I'll come back to that in a moment and what types of activities we may consider. But I want you to note this. Scrum does not mandate any sprint zero. The term is not a core Scrum term. Many teams use it. Now, I'm not actually against, by the way, the concept of inception type activities. I'm not against it, especially on larger pieces of work where we have got an organization that has got constraints, real constraints that it has to work within and needs to think about and understand what risks and what dependencies might be there. I think we need some sort of inception. What kind of activities do I think should go into an inception type period? Generating our vision, thinking about our team, thinking about our environment, thinking about what's in our initial product backlog, ensuring that our initial product backlog has got some sprint-ready PBIs at the top. That's what I think inception is useful for. The question, though, I want to ask is this: can you fit it all into a 2-week period, a sprint? If we have chosen a 2-week cadence, then should we be able to fit all of this? Seriously, I come across organizations that say, hey, Scrum's awesome, we wish we could do it, but there's no way we can get all of this sprint zero stuff into 2 weeks. I'm like, guys, you're missing the point here. What we need to think about is what needs to go into inception, how long should it be? Now, again, if we are a startup in a garage, inception may take hours or a couple days even, maybe. If we are working in a large telco, for example, on a very large project, the inception may take longer than 2 weeks, and that's okay. I want that period of time to be as short as possible, as is practical. Why? Because I want to get in and start validating what we're doing as quickly as possible, but not at the cost of completely painting ourselves into a corner and just starting to build things and chasing our tail for the rest of the whole project. So we need to think, what is fit for purpose? So sprint zero, firstly, is not core to Scrum. It's not a mandated activity. It's not a core Scrum term. And any inception you do does not have to fit into a sprint if it does not make sense. Now let's switch now to the end of a sprint. Some myths around that end. Now, here's a common one that I see. Scrum says you must ship or can only ship at the end of a sprint. So this is a bit of a sort of double-sided myth, okay? So the first part of it goes, hey, you must have something ready to go into production at the end of this sprint. The problem that I find is that this word potentially is often forgotten or misunderstood. This is our goal. We want something that is potentially ready to go if it makes commercial sense to do so. We do not have to go, okay? We do not have to go at the end of the sprint. This is a commercial decision that needs to get made by our product owner, okay? We've got choices. What we need to think about this word potentially shippable, we want something. Our goal, our aim, our intent is at the end of the sprint, we have something that is tested, something that is validatable, and something that is demonstrable, something we can show our stakeholder community to demonstrate progress. Now, when you release out to the big bad world, you've got all the choices in the world. You could release after several sprints, if that makes more sense. You could release, if you wanted to, every sprint. Or guess what? You could release after every single product backlog item is completed. You can practice continuous delivery with Scrum. There's no problem with that. The two aren't mutually exclusive at all. Which leads to that second part of the myth, that myth being Scrum's no longer agile enough anymore. It's saying you must wait until the end of a sprint to put something out. No one is saying that either. No one's saying that either. We need to decouple this idea of releasing to production from this cadence, okay, that we work in, this typical sprint cycle. The sprint cycle is creating for us a focus and a discipline to ensure that we at least have something that could potentially go out. This is the message, to try and to ensure that we are finishing more rather than starting more. It creates this discipline, and that is the name of the game. So firstly, you do not need to wait until the end of the sprint to release something, nor must you release something at the end of the sprint. It is up to you commercially, well, it's up to our product owner actually, in conjunction with the stakeholder community, but the sprint is about that discipline, making sure we at least have something that is tested, something validatable and demonstrable at the end of the sprint. All right, sticking with the end of the sprint, the idea is that, hey, the sprint review, okay, that inspect adapt activity that happens at the end of the sprint is the opportunity to engage with our product owner. Okay, now, here's the thing. Back in the day, it was. When Scrum first burst onto the scene, we, in fact, spoke about 30-day or a calendar month for the duration of a sprint. That's how long it was. And at the end of this period, hey, it was this opportunity to show our product owner something. And wow, that is awesome. We don't have to wait 2 years anymore. We're seeing something after every 30 days. Now, times have changed. Scrum has evolved. Just like we evolve our products, Scrum has evolved. Scrum has incrementally changed along the way. And now, the sprint review is not the opportunity to engage with the product owner. The sprint review is the opportunity to engage with the broader stakeholder community that we need to interface with. Stakeholders, customers, okay, consumers of our product. Where does the product owner get engaged? We want them engaged earlier. We want them engaged throughout. We want them engaged during the sprint. There should be no surprises for our product owners in the review. We want our product owners involved in what we might call walkthroughs. Some of you may call them shoulder checks. Think about these as little mini reviews throughout the sprint to confirm that we're on the right track and that we've met done. Now, the walkthrough is not yet an official Scrum activity. It's regarded more as a GASP, a generally accepted Scrum practice, as Mike Cohn calls it. But I think it's a damn good idea. So if you're not doing these, try and get your product owner engaging earlier, because we want to remove as much waste as possible. The review is for our stakeholders, okay? The review's for our stakeholders, not for our product owners. Okay, here's another end of sprint myth that really leads to some dysfunctional thinking. I get asked this question a fair bit. So if my team does not deliver exactly what we laid out in that sprint backlog, in that sprint plan, if we don't hit all of those, do I classify that sprint as a failure? Okay, is that a failure? Now, for me, this is a very overly simplistic way of looking at the situation, and I want to explore where this might have found its origins, where this question comes from. For me, I think it comes from, again, wording and terminology, and this perception that a sprint backlog is a sprint commitment. Now, this word commitment, this first came into being in this book here. This is Ken Schwaber's second book after the first one he did with Mike Beadle. And when he actually used the word commit here, he used it in this context, that a team commits to doing its best. Okay? In all honesty, as passionate professionals, they commit to doing their best. Now, over time, this word commit has been used differently. It's been used as this sign in blood, etched in concrete, okay? And if this sprint backlog is not completely finished at the end, you guys suck and you failed. Here is the reality. Guess when you have perfect knowledge about anything? There's one time, at the end. Exactly right, at the end. Even a short plan, a short 2-week, 10-day plan has uncertainty. A plan is not a guarantee, okay? A plan is an idea based on the evidence we have right now as to what we think we will have. That evidence may change, just like a police investigation. New evidence comes to light, we have different outcomes potentially. Short 10-day plan is susceptible to change. Now, to counter this, to an extent, might be a bit of a band-aid, the latest Scrum Guide actually deprecated the word commitment and changed it to forecast, okay? Change it to forecast. I don't think that necessarily solves the problem, because I still get people saying, but I need to classify a sprint into success or failure. How can I do that? So do you know what I do? I'll actually give them a definition. I'm happy to give them a definition. Let's paint a little picture here. So I have 2 teams, okay? Now, one team, at the end of the sprint, they work hard, by the way. They're not slacking off. One team, at the end, okay, has got 5 PBIs, nearly done. All right, they're 80% done with 5 PBIs, close. Okay, they worked hard. Something went a bit wrong. Okay, so these things happen. There's another team, though, similar situation. They work hard, no goofing offs. They actually also have 5 PBIs. They finish 4, and they don't even start the 5th one. Now, which team failed, do you think, in my book? Team 1. And why do you think Team 1 did? Well, that's the thing. For me, if you really want to use that word, you really want to use it. Why do I think Team 1 failed? I think they failed because they had the opportunity, based on this capacity, to at least finish something. If they remobilized, if they swarmed just a little bit to say, we're not going to finish everything because something has gone a bit wrong, what can we finish? They had the opportunity to finish. They didn't take the opportunity to finish anything. They came at the end with nothing. Team 2, okay, what did Team 2 end up with? They ended up with 4 increments. Now, that is not necessarily a failure at all. Now, don't get me wrong. Sure, I want this team to go to their retrospective to say to themselves, hey, was there something we missed here? I want our estimates to be as accurate as possible because hopefully that indicates to us that we understand the work that we are doing better, okay? But I don't want them to do this at the cost of underachievement. This team for me swarmed, okay? That for me is a good indication so long as they then use their retro to learn. Now, underachievement, what do I mean by that? Let's say we have this situation here. We say to a team, you know what, team? We're going to give you a big fat bonus if you hit that sprint forecast, that sprint backlog every single time perfectly. Sprint backlog set, you hit it exactly at the end. Do you know what you are going to get? Again, you're going to get this. You're going to get nice, neatly packaged up sprints that mirror exactly the sprint forecast, no problem. But I'll tell you what else you're going to start to find. You're going to get teams that think very conservatively. You're going to see teams that think so conservatively, in fact, that they will never, ever get out of their comfort zone for fear of overpromising and under-delivering. Do we want teams baking in inordinate amounts of buffer just to hit some artificial deadline? It's not what I want. So why use a sprint? For me, a sprint is a useful guide. It's a guide to allow us to shine the headlights on the detail that is right in front of us. It allows us to do rolling wave planning. It allows us to also identify potential opportunities to see where we can maybe break down a PBI so we can swarm together on it, to get more finished and less started. That is the name of the game. It is a good guide for us to do that. We need to be very careful about creating this culture of fear. If we see this, it's a false economy. You know what? Sometimes a sprint's going to spill over. Sometimes, hey, maybe a bit under. For me, though, the important thing is as long as we are using our retrospectives to learn from our mistakes. You want to look at failure? That's another sign of failure. A team that completely just repeats the same mistake after the same mistake. It's another reason I love working in sprints because it gives us that opportunity to have that retrospective, to see what's working and see what's not working. But as long as a team is learning from their mistakes and they're hitting their goals, that sprint forecast, at least the majority of the time, and that's for a mature team, then I'm generally happy. So let's watch out for this one. Let's think about how we are defining success and failure. Let's not base it on artificial targets, artificial goals. Let's base it on, are we learning from our mistakes? Are we helping each other? Are we swarming together? Are we mobilizing together? Now, another one that we see is this one, this perception that, you know what, we have to finish a requirement completely end-to-end in the same sprint. Now, the big problem with this myth, it leads to 2 issues. The first one is this one, sprint planning that goes on forever and ever and is totally painful. A couple of sprints I just picked up recently, sprint planning from hell, and I like this one. Sprint planning all damn day with people who have no clue. Dante's 7th level of hell is software development. All right. Who's been in a painful sprint planning session, yeah? Now, why does this happen? I think this happens because we get this perception that because we have these cross-functional teams and we're supposed to swarm, it means we have to swarm on a requirement completely end-to-end within the same sprint. In other words, we have to do all of the functional design, technical design, test design, building and testing for one requirement in the same sprint. Here's the problem, though. The problem is that functional design is unpredictable because more often than not, it requires socialization with subject matter experts, other groups, stakeholders. Now, if we bring that level of unpredictability into a sprint where we are trying to actually build this feature, build this PBI as well, this product backlog item, this is what ends up. We end up with bottlenecks. We end up with serious lead time issues. We end up with a lot of work in progress. What we want to think about is who is thinking a little bit ahead. I want product owners, in conjunction with any functional designers in the team, be they BAs, subject matter experts, whoever it is. I want them thinking a bit ahead. I want them acting like scouts, thinking 1 or 2 sprints ahead, laying that foundation. I'm not saying be 10 sprints ahead with this stuff. That leads to other issues of waste. But I want them thinking a little bit ahead to make sure that we are reducing this ambiguity, reducing the lead time on other groups that we may need to rely on to put something end to end. Doesn't mean they're in a separate team. They're still part of the team. They're just thinking a bit ahead. And that is a good idea. If anyone ever says, hey, that's a mini waterfall, well, it's not. I'm not saying design everything in detail up front. I'm saying be a little bit ahead. Be 1 to 2 sprints ahead with the functional design. And I want to just finish off with this final myth. This, for me, is the most dangerous myth. Now, this myth goes like this. Scrum should just work out of the box. When we leave a 2-day training course, hey, if we can't work in these lovely cross-functional teams, outputting these beautiful vertical slices of working functionality, then guess what? We can't do Scrum, or we have to practice the much maligned Scrum butt. Who's heard that term before? Scrum butt. So here's an example of Scrum butt. We try to do Scrum, but we have to conduct a testing sprint from time to time because our test automation practices aren't quite there yet. And it's viewed in a negative way. But here's the reality. Things are not going to be perfect straight away. You know, your test automation may not be there yet to be able to keep your product in a constant state of readiness. And you know what? That is okay. There is a big difference in my book between Scrum but, this kind of fake Scrum, versus what I'll call Scrum in progress. Scrum would be pretty damn hypocritical if it expected you to be able to get this up and running on day 1. It'd be very hypocritical. And it doesn't expect that. The reality is that, take my team that I just gave as an example, so long as they are trying their very best to continuously improve their test automation, to chip away at the problem, to get better, they are still doing Scrum. They are just finding their feet. But with the right focus, with the right dedication, they will get there. They will get there. And for me, that is what Scrum is actually about. Scrum is not just about incrementally and iteratively improving our products, but it's about incrementally and iteratively improving the process of Scrum. That's what it's about. It's not about just religiously following all of these magical circles and lists. We need to go back to the heart of it all. The real essence of Scrum. What is that? It's closing feedback loops, having the desire to close them as quickly as we can, but also thinking to ourselves, how can we just continuously improve both our product and our process? That, for me, is what Scrum is truly about, and if you are thinking in that manner, then you are an Agilist in my book. Thank you very much.